Can you believe that an entire civilization, a sprawling empire that had defined the known world for 4 centuries, could simply vanish into the fog? We are talking about the ultimate historical disappearing act, a vacuum of power so profound it would unleash a wave of horror and bloodshed that still echoes in the very language we speak today. This wasn't a slow decline. This was a sudden, heart-stopping cardiac arrest. Imagine the year 410 AD. The last of the Roman legions, those symbols of ultimate, unyielding authority, were pulling out of Britannia, packing up their meticulously crafted armor and marching south, leaving the people they were sworn to protect completely defenseless. They left behind polished villas, straight roads that defied the rugged landscape, and magnificent bathhouses. But crucially, they left behind a population that had forgotten how to fight, a population that had relied solely on the might of the eagle to keep the wolves from the door. Now, the wolves weren't just at the door, they were tearing it off the hinges, baying for blood in the newly emptied darkness. The horror was immediate. The Picts and the Scots, those savage, painted warriors from beyond Hadrian's Wall, saw the retreating Roman backs and descended like a plague, their terrifying war cries echoing across the undefended northern plains. It was a catastrophe no one saw coming, or perhaps a catastrophe everyone saw coming but felt powerless to stop, paralyzed by the sudden realization that the safety net had been completely shredded. The remaining Romano-British leadership, desperate and sweating with fear, needed a solution, a shield to stand between their crumbling world and the unrelenting savagery of the north. Their pleas for help, famously written to the great Roman general Aetius, were titled The Groans of the Britons, a document dripping with despair, begging the emperor to send just 1 legion back to save them from drowning in their own terror. Aetius, busy battling Attila the Hun, the scourge of God himself, had bigger problems than a distant, rainy island. The plea was ignored. The Britons were on their own, staring into the abyss of annihilation, and this existential threat led to the single worst, most boneheaded strategic blunder in the history of the island. They decided, in a moment of utter panic and staggering short-sightedness, to hire mercenaries. They would fight fire with fire, recruiting hardened, terrifying warriors from across the cold, mysterious North Sea. They invited the barbarians in. Can you imagine the hubris, the sheer, unadulterated madness of inviting the predators to guard the flock? From the shores of Jutland and the regions of Lower Saxony, the longships began to appear. Not just 1 or 2, but a creeping, relentless tide of vessels, their dragon-headed prows slicing through the freezing foam. These weren't diplomats. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, tribes utterly alien to the civilized Roman world, masters of brutality and pagan fervor. The stories say that the initial leaders were 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa, whose names would forever be etched in the blood-soaked foundation of a new nation. They arrived, ostensibly, as allies, defenders hired by the hapless King Vortigern to fight the northern threat, and for a short while they fulfilled their contract, driving the Picts back with ruthless efficiency. But these new arrivals weren't interested in a temporary paycheck. They looked at the green, fertile land. They looked at the rich, undefended fields. And they looked at the soft, terrified population that had forgotten the smell of spilled blood. They saw not a job site, but a land ripe for the taking. The cities, London, York, Bath, once centers of sophisticated culture, were abandoned. The magnificent structures were left to crumble. their sophisticated plumbing systems choked with weeds. The Britons fled, retreating westward into the mountainous strongholds of Wales and Cornwall, clinging desperately to the last vestiges of their Roman identity. This wasn't just a change of government. This was cultural genocide. The language, the religion, the very memory of Rome was systematically erased in the East and South. A dark age truly descended, a period so opaque, so filled with violence and migration, that historians still argue over the very timeline of the ensuing 150 years. This is where the story truly begins, in the chaotic, fiery, and deeply uncertain decades following the ultimate betrayal. We stand now on the shores, watching the longships land, knowing that every single soul on board is about to become a foundational brick in a new, savage kingdom built entirely on conquest and blood feud. Prepare yourself, because the next 1,000 years will be defined by religious wars, ceaseless Viking terror, magnificent kings rising from the squalor, and betrayals that would make Machiavelli blush. This is not history to fall asleep to. This is the true, terrifying origin story of England itself. Vortigern's invitation was the single greatest error in British history, a fatal wound from which the island would never recover. The ships of the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, did not arrive as desperate supplicants seeking refuge. They sailed as calculating predators who had scented blood and weakness across the narrow seas. The moment the brothers Hengist and Horsa stepped onto the Kentish shore, they saw not a land to defend, but a rich, defenseless treasure ripe for the taking. Vortigern offered them the Isle of Thanet, a small piece of land for their service, thinking he had bought peace. He had merely purchased his own doom. These mercenaries, clad in the harsh iron of the European mainland, quickly realized the impotence of their paymaster. They demanded more food, more land, and when Vortigern balked, the contract was immediately nullified, replaced by the grim language of the blade. The invasion was not a sudden blitzkrieg. It was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage that lasted over a century. The initial betrayals were localized, horrific acts of treachery where former allies turned on their hosts, plunging the eastern half of Britain into an unparalleled era of fire and displacement. The first great wave of terror saw the collapse of the Roman infrastructure that had held the province together for 400 years. Cities like Londinium and Eboracum, once magnificent symbols of imperial power, became charred ruins, abandoned by their sophisticated populations. The archaeological record speaks in terrifying whispers. Villas burned to the ground, coin circulation ceasing entirely, and cemeteries filled with the hastily buried dead showing signs of brutal battlefield trauma. This was not a transition. It was a societal decapitation. As the native Romano-British were pushed west, they fragmented, retreating into the rugged hills of Wales and Cornwall, clinging desperately to the Latin language and the Christian faith they had inherited. They called the invaders the Saxons, a name synonymous with barbarity and total destruction. But from this deep pit of despair, a flicker of resistance ignited. The remnants of the old Roman military structure sought to unify the fractured British kingdoms. They needed a dux bellorum, a battle commander, to face the relentless tide. This is where the legend is forged from the harsh reality. A historical figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, stepped forward, embodying the last true flame of Roman tactical genius and aristocratic resolve.
He was the general who understood how to fight a guerrilla war against the overwhelming numbers of the invaders. It is around Ambrosius that the mythos of the great defender, the once and future king, began to coalesce. He was the historical foundation for the figure we know as Arthur, a man who, whether entirely real or a composite of several heroes, became the living symbol of defiance. The Age of Arthur was not a fairy tale of shining castles. It was 50 years of relentless, brutal warfare, where Britain fought tooth and nail for its very survival against the Germanic onslaught. Every battle was existential. The invaders were forced to retreat, licking their wounds and consolidating their gains along the eastern and southern coasts. For the next 50 to 70 years, a miraculous peace settled over the interior of Britain, often called the Golden Age of the Britons, a last, precious breath before the inevitable suffocation. While the Britons celebrated their hard-won reprieve, the Germanic tribes were not defeated. They were rooting themselves into the soil, renaming the very rivers and hills with their harsh, guttural tongue. The Angles, the most numerous, secured the north and central plains. They were not temporary settlers. They were permanent occupiers, carving out defined territories based on their tribal origins. The Jutes solidified their grip on Kent. The Saxons established their presence through Wessex, West Saxons, Essex, East Saxons, and Sussex, South Saxons. This violent geopolitical restructuring led directly to the creation of the infamous Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, the 7 perpetually warring kingdoms that would define the next 4 centuries of British history. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. 7 nascent monarchies, each vying for the coveted title of Bretwalda, the supreme ruler of all the kingdoms. These kingdoms were not defined by fixed borders, but by the ambition and sheer ruthlessness of their kings, each one claiming descent from the god Woden himself to legitimize their rule through divine bloodline. The history of the Heptarchy is a dizzying, terrifying tapestry of civil war, assassination, shifting alliances, and constant, bloody struggle for total dominion. No peace was permanent. Every king slept with one eye open, knowing the dagger of the neighboring warlord was always seeking his throat. The era of Roman law and ordered life was utterly extinguished, replaced by the law of the strong arm and the chilling fidelity of the warband, the comitatus. Loyalty was purchased with gold and land, and betrayal was the most common form of political discourse. This was a land completely fractured, a collection of pagan power bases focused solely on conquest and survival. The Anglo-Saxon conquest was not just a change of rulers, it was a fundamental, brutal reprogramming of the island's cultural and spiritual DNA, driving the original inhabitants to the fringes of their own homeland. Imagine the psychological collapse, the flickering lights of civilized villa life giving way to the dark, pagan rituals of warriors who worshipped gods of thunder, fury, and iron. The invaders surged inland, pushing the indigenous population, the proud, Christianized Britons, westward like a tide retreating before a devastating geological cataclysm. Every Roman road, every crumbling stone fort became a contested battlefield where the fate of a culture was decided with axes and shield walls. But history demands a hero when the world burns, and out of the smoke and the desperate rallying cries emerged whispers of a formidable leader. This was a military genius, a Roman Briton warlord known in later fading memories as Artorius, the very foundation of the legend of Arthur. This was not the chivalrous knight in shining armor of medieval romance. This was a brutal, pragmatic cavalry commander fighting for survival in the mud and blood of shattered Britain. He supposedly led the shattered British resistance to a temporary shattering victory, the pinnacle of which was the legendary Battle of Mount Badon around the year 500 AD. For a generation, perhaps even two, the Anglo-Saxon advance was momentarily paralyzed, pinned down by this terrifying, unified British counterforce. The invaders were forced to consolidate rather than expand, holding tight to the coastal areas they had already violently seized. But the respite was tragically fragile, a temporary dam against an ocean of relentless conquest. Once Arthur's unifying force faded, whether through an unknown betrayal, death in battle, or the simple, cruel attrition of history, the dam broke entirely. The invaders solidified their holdings with devastating efficiency, carving out territories defined by blood feuds and tribal loyalties. This monumental, violent land division gave rise to what historians dramatically call the Heptarchy, the 7 sovereign, eternally warring kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. These weren't friendly neighbors sharing treaties. They were 7 ravenous wolves tearing at the carcass of Britain, each one desperate to dominate the others. The Northumbrians dominated the frigid north, a wild and expansionist powerhouse fueled by sheer audacity and brutal kings like Edwin. To the south, the kingdom of Mercia was waiting, a landlocked behemoth ruled by iron-fisted monarchs obsessed with ruthless supremacy, always challenging the fluctuating power of Wessex, the ultimate southern rival. Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, and Kent rounded out this chaotic collection of murderous states. And with these kingdoms came a culture diametrically opposed to the Christian gentility that had briefly flowered under Roman patronage. This was the era of the comitatus, the warrior band, bound not by citizenship, but by the absolute fanatical loyalty sworn to the chieftain. Their relationship was sealed not by ceremony, but by shared plunder, shared carnage, and the promise of glorious death in battle. Their religion was a chilling pantheon of primal gods echoing the harsh German forests. Woden, the terrifying god of fury and ecstatic poetry, the ultimate deceiver and war leader. Twiv, the one-handed god of single combat and justice. Thunor, the thunder god whose hammer smashed through the ranks of their enemies. Human sacrifice was not unheard of. The very soil of Britain was being consecrated by pagan ritual, replacing the memory of the Roman cross. Law was not based on abstract Roman statute. It was brutal, personal, and meticulously quantifiable. If you killed a man, you didn't face a complex imperial court. You faced his family's terrifying wrath, unless you could immediately pay the wergild, the cold price of a man's life. Every life, from the lowliest slave to the highest king, had a specific, calculated value in silver, a chilling equation ensuring that even murder was merely a transactional cost in this new, brutally pragmatic society. This system was designed not for peace, but to manage the inevitable cycles of vengeance. The Britons, the original inhabitants, were permanently reduced to the western fringes. Wales, or Walos, meaning foreigner in Old English, a searing insult hurled by the conquerors, and the hard peninsula of Cornwall. Their language, their history, their very existence was being aggressively erased from the central and eastern plains, which now bore the stamp of the Angles and Saxons, not the proud heritage of the Celts. The invaders weren't adapting to Britain, they were fundamentally replacing it. The majestic Roman road network, once the artery of civilization, crumbled, not because the Anglo-Saxons lacked the skills to maintain it, but because their localized, tribal society relied on river travel and fortified settlements, not vast imperial connectivity. The grand stone ruins of Roman cities became terrifying, haunted quarries for the Anglo-Saxons, structures they called entigo work, the astonishing, eerie work of giants. They didn't understand the past, they only understood the blood-soaked land they now violently possessed. This was the deep, irreversible stratification of Britain, setting the stage for centuries of internal conflict where the Anglo-Saxons fought each other just as fiercely as they fought the desperate, cornered remnants of the original inhabitants. The stage was set for the clash of kings, the rise and fall of pagan dynasties, and the eventual, terrifying return of a faith that would try to tame these savage lands: Christianity. But that transformation, that cultural upheaval, was still centuries of blood, political maneuvering, and divine intervention away. For now, Britain was the land of the axe, the shield, and the pagan war cry. The ink on the contracts wasn't even dry before the true horror of Vortigern's disastrous bargain began to unfold. He thought he had bought security. He had only purchased his own executioner. The Germanic warriors, Hengist and Horsa, the Jutes, the first wave of the Great Migration, saw the lush, undefended fields of Kent and realized the meager price Vortigern was paying them was an insult to their blood-soaked ambitions. They had tasted British soil, and they wanted the whole feast, not just the scraps of tribute they were being offered. They began to demand increasingly outrageous supplies. More grain, more beer, more land for their growing families. They were not here to serve, they were here to seize. Vortigern, already politically crippled and fearing his own regional rivals more than the men he had just hired, could only stammer compliance, watching his precarious authority bleed out with every new concession. The mercenaries understood his fear was their greatest weapon. The Saxons, having seen the Jutes successfully gain a foothold, began to arrive in waves, not small war bands anymore, but entire populations, dragging their families, their gods, and their fierce, uncompromising worldview across the churning, unforgiving North Sea. They didn't just fight for territory, they fought to erase what was already there, to replace the existing culture wholesale. The historical record is almost silent on these years, a terrifying void historians call the sub-Roman period, but silence, in this context, screams catastrophe. It tells the story of shattered infrastructure, mass flight, and the systematic dismantling of 5 centuries of Roman-British culture. Cities that had proudly stood for generations, Verulamium, Londinium, Caleva, were abandoned, or worse, put to the torch, their stone walls offering no defense against the speed and savagery of the raiding warbands. The initial invasion was a hammer blow directed squarely at the eastern and southern coasts. The British population, soft from generations of Roman peace and decentralized governance, suddenly found themselves facing warriors who lived for battle, men who viewed death in combat as the only honorable passage to the next life. This was not a border skirmish. This was existential cleansing, a violent transfer of civilization. But where there is darkness, the legends must ignite. Amidst the chaos of collapsing kingdoms and vanishing legions, one figure began to solidify the desperate British resistance: Ambrosius Aurelianus. He was a man of high birth, possibly the last true Roman citizen left with the tactical knowledge and lineage to challenge the invaders on their own terms. He was the flicker of the old empire's fire, refusing to be extinguished by the pagan darkness. Ambrosius didn't just fight battles. He organized the fragmented British forces, transforming terrified farmers and scattered noblemen into a cohesive, if constantly outmatched, fighting force. He understood that to survive, the Britons needed to stop the petty internal feuds and face the unified horror sweeping the land. He became the organizing principle, the commander who understood geometry and discipline in a world reverting to primal chaos. For decades, the struggle was a seesaw of unimaginable brutality. The Saxons would push inland, establishing temporary strongholds, only to be violently repulsed by organized British shield walls commanded by Ambrosius's lieutenants. The invaders were relentless, but the defenders were fighting for their homes, their language, and their very existence, and that desperation lent them unnatural strength. The fighting solidified the deep tribal hatred that would define this island for the next 1,000 years. Every skirmish was a blood oath. Every defeat meant certain annihilation for the local population. It was a time when heroes were forged in the instant between life and death. The Saxons learned quickly that while Britain was undefended by Rome, it was far from empty. They could raid easily, yes, but holding the inland territories proved a far bloodier endeavor than Hengist had ever promised. As the fighting raged, the victorious Germanic groups began to settle their claims permanently, carving out territories based on their tribal origins and successful conquest routes. The Jutes cemented their grip on Kent, that first fatal foothold. The Saxons, driven by fierce internal competition, started forming what would become Sussex, South Saxons, Wessex, West Saxons, and Essex, East Saxons, slowly pushing the Britons towards the Western Mountains and the Cornish Peninsula. Meanwhile, the Angles, the most numerous and arguably the most ambitious of the three main groups, pushed north, staking huge claims in East Anglia and the massive, sprawling northern territory that would eventually coalesce into the fearsome kingdom of Northumbria. The map of Britain was not just being redrawn, it was being violently hammered into 7 distinct, perpetually warring new political entities, the nascent Heptarchy. This violent fragmentation was the true, agonizing birth pang of England itself. This conquest was not merely territorial, it was profoundly religious. The Romano-Britons clung fiercely to their newly established Christianity, the faith that had flourished under Rome. The invaders, however, brought with them the ancient, powerful pagan pantheon, Woden, the terrifying all-father of fury and inspiration, Teve, the god of single combat, and Thunor, Thor, the thunderous wielder of the hammer. The clash between the gentle doctrines of the crucified Christ and the brutal sacrificial demands of the Germanic gods added a terrifying fanaticism to the warfare. Every battle was seen as a contest not just between men, but between entire spiritual universes. The Britons saw the Saxons as the instruments of the devil. The Saxons saw the Britons as weak, soft, adherents of a defeated god. By the close of the 5th century, despite the tactical genius of Ambrosius, the sheer weight of the ongoing invasion was becoming unbearable. The Britons were pushed back into the rugged terrain of the West, Wales and Cornwall, the lands they referred to, tellingly, as Cymru, the land of companions. They were survivors, but their great Roman legacy was gone, swallowed whole by the roaring, hungry, pagan tide that had overrun the heartland. The stage was set for the final, desperate act of the resistance, a battle so decisive, so catastrophic in its scale, that it would halt the Saxon advance for a generation and forge the very legend of the British identity. But for now, the Anglo-Saxon grip was tightening, cold and final, over the shattered remains of what was once Britannia, and the Britons knew that the next major engagement might be the very last stand. But sometimes, when the darkness is deepest, a single, improbable star ignites the sky. The Britons, scattered and leaderless, needed a miracle, a champion whose name would echo through eternity, a man who understood that if they fought as individual tribes, they would surely perish. But if they stood as one, they might just buy themselves the crucial, life-saving gift of time. They found him, or perhaps he found them. His name, often lost in the deep, confusing mists of history and later buried under the weight of far more famous legends, was Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man described by the few remaining frightened chroniclers as the last of the Romans, carrying the sacred, dying fire of civilization in his heart while the barbarians raged around him. He was a general, yes, a man schooled in the tactics of the defunct empire, but more importantly, he was a rallying cry, a tangible promise that the eagles had not yet completely fallen from the sky. Ambrosius didn't rely on shattered, nostalgic legions. He organized the fierce, decentralized British warbands, merging their savage, desperate courage with the cold, disciplined strategies of his powerful ancestors. He forged a new fighting force, the Comitatus, a brotherhood bound not by imperial paychecks, which had long since vanished, but by an unbreakable, sacred loyalty to the war chief, ready to die for him and the very soil they defended. He instilled discipline where there was chaos and hope where there was only crushing despair, preparing them for the ultimate confrontation that history demanded. And then it came, the thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the entire invasion and threatened to reverse the course of destiny, the Battle of Mons Bodonics. The exact location is tragically lost to time, deliberately obscured by the grinding, relentless wheel of history, but the impact of that day remains terrifyingly indisputable. This was not just a skirmish between two raiding groups. This was the brutal, definitive reckoning, the final stand of Romanized Britain. For years, the Anglo-Saxon armies, confident and brutalized by years of easy, unchallenged victory, marched toward what they assumed would be the final, pitiful massacre of the British resistance. They were met not by terrified peasants running for their lives, but by an organized, immovable wall of shielded fury, guided by a military genius, Ambrosius, who utilized the terrain and every scrap of tactical knowledge with chilling precision. Imagine the noise, the deafening roar of 10,000 throats, the horrific clash of iron shields, the desperate yells in Old Welsh and the guttural shouts of Old English, the air thick with thrown spears and the desperate prayers of men who knew this specific day determined the fate of their entire cultural memory. Ambrosius, or the mysterious mounted leader who legend later called Arthur, led the charge, a sudden devastating whirlwind of improbable victory that smashed into the Saxon lines. For nearly 50 years following Mons Bodonics, the Anglo-Saxon advance stopped dead in its tracks. This was the legendary peace of the 6th century, a precious, fragile and hard-won respite that allowed the surviving British kingdoms, Dumnonia in the south, Powys in the center, Reged in the north, to breathe again and, tragically, to forget the immediate, lurking danger. They settled back into their local squabbles, rebuilding their damaged hill forts and resuming their fierce, self-destructive internal politics, foolishly believing the terrible shadow had passed permanently into myth. This was the absolute high watermark for the British spirit, A brief, shining, golden era where poets sang of their great victory, and the Saxon threat seemed forever confined to the eastern shores, gnawing bitterly at its deep wounds. But the Anglo-Saxons were far from defeated. They were merely licking their wounds, reorganizing, and most crucially, learning the hard lessons of unified opposition. They had secured the coastal lowlands, the fertile agricultural heart of the island, and they used this time of peace to consolidate their hold, transforming their temporary, raiding settlements into permanent administrative kingdoms. Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Kent were born from the ashes of British defeat and hard-nosed Saxon determination. The year is roughly 550 A.D., and the calm is about to be violently ripped apart forever. A new generation of Saxon leaders, born on British soil and knowing nothing but the thirst for war, began to look westward again, not with the hesitant steps of invited mercenaries, but with the cold, absolute confidence of rightful, preordained rulers. They had learned the vital lessons of Mons Bedonics. They would no longer attack piecemeal. Instead, coordination began on a terrifying scale. Mercia in the central Midlands, Northumbria in the vast north. These terrifying new powerhouses were coalescing, driven by fiercely ambitious kings hungry for land and eternal glory. The fragmentation of the British kingdoms, who had criminally wasted their 50 years of grace fighting each other, made them simple, perfect targets for this coordinated offensive. Now, the great British cities, which had briefly seen a small resurgence of trade and life, began to fall one by one, succumbing not to a single catastrophic battle like Bedonics, but to the slow, brutal, continuous grind of relentless pressure. The cultural boundaries were hardening, becoming iron walls. The Britons were pushed further and further west into the rough mountains and isolated peninsulas, Cornwall, Wales, Cymru, becoming the Wales, the foreigners or strangers in their own ancestral land, a derogatory name given to them by the very people they had initially invited in to protect them. The map of Britain was being violently and ruthlessly redrawn, evolving into the patchwork quilt of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms known historically as the terrifying Heptarchy. 7 major powers constantly vying for terrifying dominance, yet chillingly united in their steady, relentless pressure against the rapidly fading light of British independence. Who would dominate this terrifying new geopolitical landscape? The battle was now not just Britain versus Saxon, but Saxon versus Saxon, a vicious, cutthroat struggle for the title of Bretwalda, the wide ruler or high king of the entire island. This was a crown forged in the ultimate betrayal, cemented in rivers of blood, and every ambitious monarch in the Heptarchy was desperately reaching for it, ready to slaughter his own rivals and sometimes his own family to claim ultimate authority. The stage was set for the darkest, most cutthroat phase of the Anglo-Saxon era, where the greatest danger often came not from the remaining British enclaves, but from the brutal ambition residing within the hearts of their own neighboring kings. And as these kingdoms solidified their pagan, blood-soaked rule, a new, unforeseen force was already preparing to land on their shores, a force far more potent than any sword or shield, the quiet, irresistible invasion of the Christian faith. The game was far from over, it was just beginning. The physical land had been conquered by axe and shield, painted crimson with the blood of the displaced Britons. But now a new war began, fought not with iron, but with whispered words and silent crucifixes, a conflict that would determine not just who ruled the fields of Wessex, but the eternal destination of every soul in this newly formed tempestuous land. This was the spiritual Armageddon, the definitive battle between the old savage gods of the forest and the singular, all-encompassing deity of Rome. Out of the ashes of the lost Roman Empire, the Church mounted its audacious counter-invasion. The year was 597 AD, and Pope Gregory the Great, legendarily moved by the sight of fair-haired Angle boys sold into slavery, non-Angli, said Angeli, not Angles but angels, launched his decisive, calculated strike. He dispatched Augustine, a man armed only with the Latin Gospels and an iron will, straight into the heart of the Saxon machine, Kent, ruled by the formidable King Ethelbert. Kent was the inevitable beachhead, positioned closest to the continental power structures, but it was still a land dedicated to Woden and the terrifying pantheon of the northern gods. Ethelbert, however, was no fool. He was already married to Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess, a subtle crack already in the pagan foundation. But more than romance, the king saw geopolitical power. He understood the desperate need to link his small kingdom to the vast, wealthy trade networks of continental Europe, and the prestige of the civilized Roman world, a prestige the brutal Saxons desperately craved. He allowed Augustine to preach, but crucially, he first demanded the meeting take place in the open air, outside his royal halls. He was terrified that the Christian magic or sorcery might be more potent than his ancestral Wodenic protections if confined within walls, a suspicion born of pure fear and calculation. A calculated risk that paid off for Augustine, leading to the king's eventual baptism and the rapid conversion of thousands of his subjects, providing the Roman Church its crucial, unbreakable foothold. Meanwhile, across the fractured, warring landscape, the political map was solidifying into the terrifying structure known historically as the Heptarchy. 7 warring kingdoms locked in a perpetual, bloody struggle for dominance, each one fighting for every inch of contested territory. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, 7 thrones, 7 knives aimed perpetually at each other's throats. Survival was temporary, victory was always provisional. Each powerful king, soaked in the blood of his rivals, dreamed of holding the title that truly mattered, the Bretwalda, the Briton ruler, the supreme overlord whose authority demanded tribute, military service, and above all, fear from all other kings. For a time, the spotlight swung violently north to the massive, sprawling power of Northumbria, forged under the mighty King Edwin. Edwin stood at the precipice of power and conversion, a man haunted by omens and visions, a true Shakespearean figure caught between the savage past and the dawning future. It was here, in the cold, echoing halls of Northumbria, that the famous debate of the Witenagemot, the King's Council of Wise Men, unfolded, an event dripping with historical magnitude, the moment when the scales tipped decisively toward the cross and away from the hammer of Thor. Kofi, the chief pagan priest himself, stood up, shattering the silence, not with reverence for the old gods, but with a shocking denunciation of their weakness and their betrayal. He declared that his lifelong faith had brought him no tangible reward, no true power, no deeper understanding, railing against the gods who failed their most dedicated servant. Then came the speech that defined a generation, the famous parable of the sparrow, delivered by a venerable elder. He described human life as the frantic flight of a sparrow through a warm, brightly lit hall on a bitterly cold winter's night. It enters from the dark void, enjoys a brief, fleeting moment of warmth and light inside the hall, and then vanishes back out into the freezing, unknowable storm. If the new Christian teaching offered certainty about where the sparrow came from and, more importantly, where it went upon leaving the light, then it must be embraced. The darkness demanded illumination. The fear of the unknown demanded a promise of eternity. Edwin immediately converted, tearing down the idols of his ancestors and transforming Northumbria into a bastion of the new faith, ready to challenge the pagan strongholds. But the spiritual conquest was not unified, adding a layer of dangerous complication to the political turmoil. While Augustine's Roman mission advanced from the south, bearing the structured, centralized power of the papacy, a fiercer, older, and perhaps more dedicated stream of Christianity surged from the west and north. This was the Celtic Christianity, centered on the mystical island of Iona, driven by missionaries like the fiercely ascetic Aidan. They were not structured bishops and political emissaries. They were wandering holy warriors, monks preaching an intense, personal, and uncompromising faith forged in the isolation of the Irish Sea. Aidan established his base at Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, transforming Northumbria into the ultimate battleground where two diametrically opposed forms of the same faith collided: the Roman precision, calendar, and hierarchy versus the Celtic fervor, mysticism, and monastic organization. This dual spiritual invasion fueled the political machinery, creating kings who were martyrs, churches that were burned down by pagan rivals like Penda of Mercia and immediately rebuilt with astonishing zeal, and a ceaseless, violent tension that defined the 7th century. The Anglo-Saxons were finally forging their identity, not just in blood and conquest, but in the white-hot forge of religious war that promised ultimate glory or eternal damnation. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown between the two forms of Christianity, a conflict so profound it would eventually require a formal synod, the Council of Whitby, to decide the true, singular path of the English Church. The conversion had begun, but the chaos was far from over. It had only just elevated the stakes to infinity. But even Ethelbald was merely a bloody, violent prelude to the true monster of Mercian power, King Offa, reigned 757–796 AD. This was no petty warlord scrabbling for farmland. Offa was a continental player, a man whose shadow stretched across the churning North Sea to the court of Charlemagne himself, the greatest power broker in Western Europe. Offa understood that true power was not just victory in battle, but control over commerce, the careful minting of regulated coinage, the standardized silver penny, and the absolute authority to rewrite maps and history. He was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to truly attempt to replicate the sprawling, systematic governance of the Romans they had supposedly replaced, treating Mercia not as a temporary warband but as a permanent international sovereignty. Offa's ambition manifested in a physical, terrifying monument, Offa's Dyke. Not a simple ditch, but a colossal 150-mile-long defensive earthwork, slicing through the landscape like a freshly opened wound, separating his established English domain from the unruly, perpetually hostile Britons of Wales. This dike was a statement of finality, a declaration hammered out in earth and stone that the age of easy expansion was over, and the borders were now sealed by a king who claimed ownership of reality itself. It was an engineering feat that spoke volumes about the resources and the absolute coercive power Offa commanded, a line in the dirt stating, "Here ends your world, and here begins mine." He was so formidable that Charlemagne treated him as an equal, exchanging embassies and negotiating trade treaties, a level of respect no English king had commanded since the legions departed. Yet, while Offa was busy sculpting the physical boundaries of England with dirt and sweat, the northern kingdom of Northumbria experienced a completely different kind of explosion, the incandescent brilliance of the mind. This was the true Anglo-Saxon Golden Age, a brief, fragile period when the monasteries ceased to be mere outposts of faith and transformed into the ultimate reservoirs of classical learning, saving civilization itself from the encroaching darkness. The intellectual heartbeat of this era throbbed from Jarrow and Wearmouth, the twin monasteries overseen by the ultimate scholar, the Venerable Bede. Bede was not just a monk. He was the singular, towering genius who fundamentally reshaped how history was recorded, not just for England, but for all of Europe. He wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a monumental work completed around 731 AD that provided the chronological framework, the very backbone of early English identity, meticulously tracing the island's descent from Roman rule through the terror of the invaders and the slow, miraculous growth of the English Church. What makes Bede a legend, a revolutionary in the truest sense, is his meticulous insistence on dating events not from the confused short reigns of obscure local kings, but from the pivotal moment of Christ's incarnation, Anno Domini. This seemingly small shift fundamentally standardized timekeeping and anchored the English story onto the universal timeline of Christian Europe, giving it a weight and coherence it desperately lacked. Imagine the sheer audacity. A monk in a remote island monastery, defining the very cadence of historical measurement used globally for the next millennium. He cataloged the stars, he mastered mathematics, he translated the core texts of faith, and he did it all while the political world outside his cell walls was perpetually engaged in betrayal and bloody regicide. His work preserved knowledge that would have otherwise vanished in the dust of endless warfare, providing a lifeline of literacy and historical consciousness when the rest of the continent often struggled simply to remember last Tuesday. But the Golden Age, like all brilliant, high-intensity moments in history, carried within it the fatal seeds of its own destruction. The very resources that funded these incredible libraries, the concentrated wealth of the monasteries, the centralized stockpiling of artistic treasures, made them targets of incomprehensible desirability. Mercian supremacy, though potent under Offa, was temporary. Upon his death in 796 AD, the power vacuum instantly erupted into vicious, exhausting civil wars that bled the strength of the Midlands dry, shattering the fragile peace he had enforced. Northumbria, steeped in scholarship and spiritual contemplation, lacked the necessary iron fist to defend its own glory. Its kings were often assassinated, its political life a shambles of feuding nobles. The Heptarchy was a house of cards, now weakened by internal exhaustion and ready to collapse into the abyss at the slightest external tremor. They had survived the internal struggles, they had embraced the cross, and they had built an intellectual fortress that shone brighter than any other in the West. But they had forgotten to watch the terrifying, churning horizon of the North Sea, where a new, infinitely more brutal enemy was already loading their longships, drawn by the smell of undefended gold and the promise of utter destruction. The prologue of the Anglo-Saxon story was over. The main act, the Age of Ragnarok, was about to begin with a horrifying, blood-soaked crescendo that would rewrite the map of England in fire and Viking steel. The petty squabbles that defined the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, the endless border wars between Mercia and Wessex, the theological arguments emanating from Northumbria, were about to be rendered laughably insignificant. For nearly 4 centuries, they had survived the initial shock of their own arrival, establishing a fragile, flawed civilization. But the storm that finally broke over them in the mid-9th century was not a storm of rain or minor raids. It was the arrival of Ragnarok itself, a world-ending event known to history as the Great Heathen Army. This was not a handful of longships seeking seasonal loot. This was an army of occupation, a literal population migration led by men whose very names were synonymous with terror and cold, calculated vengeance. They landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, an armada of unprecedented scale. Chroniclers, accustomed to exaggerating skirmishes, struggled to find words grand enough to describe the mass of screaming warriors and the terrifying complexity of their logistical support. These Vikings were not just fighters, they were military engineers, masters of rapid fortification, and strategists capable of long-term campaigning. The stage was now set for the main prize, the source of the grievance, Northumbria. The Northumbrians, predictably, were locked in civil war between 2 rival kings, Osberth and Ella. They finally united their forces, realizing the existential peril, only when the Vikings were literally hammering on the gates of their capital, York. This belated unity achieved nothing but a quicker path to mutual destruction. The heathen army, now firmly entrenched, began its relentless march south, targeting Mercia, the vast central kingdom that had long dominated the Heptarchy. King Burgred of Mercia, watching the rapid disintegration of his neighbors, panicked. He appealed for help to the only major kingdom still standing, Wessex. This was the first, frantic admission that the Anglo-Saxon world could no longer survive without unified action. King Ethelred of Wessex, the elder brother of the future legend, rushed north with his forces to relieve the siege of Nottingham. The campaign was not a glorious victory, but a grinding, bloody stalemate. Ultimately, Mercia was forced to buy peace with the ultimate humiliation, paying the Danegeld, a colossal tribute of silver that financially crippled the kingdom and acknowledged the terrifying reality of Viking power. Mercia was reduced to a tributary state, its independence shattered. The year 871 AD arrived, a date that would be burned into the memory of every Anglo-Saxon as the Year of Battles. The great heathen army, having crippled Mercia, turned its entire focus onto the last standing kingdom, Wessex, the final bastion of Anglo-Saxon culture and resistance. The intensity of this year was unparalleled. The Anglo-Saxons fought at least 9 major engagements against the Vikings in a continuous, desperate defense of their homeland. The Vikings seized the critical town of Reading, turning it into their fortified war camp, a staging ground for the invasion of Wessex proper. Ethelred and his young, charismatic brother Alfred fought side by side, achieving minor victories only to suffer immediate, devastating losses elsewhere. It was a war of attrition where the Vikings held all the advantages in numbers and morale. The pivotal clash came at the Battle of Ashdown. While King Ethelred was reportedly paralyzed by fear or deep prayer, refusing to leave his tent until the appropriate liturgy was complete, it was the young Alfred who took command of the main battle lines. Alfred, barely 22, showed a stunning, almost reckless bravery, leading a ferocious charge up the hill, fighting like a possessed berserker, and ultimately shattering the Viking forces. Ashdown was a glorious, morale-boosting victory, but it was merely a pause, not a true reversal. The losses sustained by Wessex were catastrophic. Weeks later, King Ethelred succumbed, possibly to wounds sustained in the unrelenting campaign, or perhaps simply to the crushing strain of command during a total war. The crown did not pass in peaceful succession. It was thrust onto the shoulders of Alfred in the middle of a continuous battlefield, during the height of the most existential invasion the island had ever faced. He inherited a kingdom that was bleeding out, surrounded by enemies on every side, with his treasury depleted and his military stretched past breaking point. The great heathen army was still massed in the north, hungry, powerful, and demanding total surrender. The survival of Anglo-Saxon England now rested entirely upon the frail, sickly shoulders of King Alfred, the man destined to become the defining savior of the entire saga. His trial by fire was not beginning. He was already standing neck-deep in the scorching flames. The year is 878 AD, and the world has truly ended. The mighty Viking war machine, led by the utterly ruthless Guthrum, launched a devastating winter surprise attack, a strategic maneuver so brutal and unexpected that the entire Anglo-Saxon defense structure simply vaporized overnight. Wessex, the last bastion of hope, crumbled into dust, its royal halls abandoned, its defenders scattered to the four winds, leaving only the sound of Danish axes echoing through the silent forests of what was once a proud kingdom. Alfred, the anointed king, the man who swore to protect his people even unto death, was suddenly nothing more than a ghost, a hunted shadow fleeing across the frozen mud, stripped of his crown, his army, and nearly his sanity. He was a fugitive, chased by the specter of total annihilation, driven to the absolute edge of human endurance, as the Danish forces settled in to carve up their final prize. His refuge was not a fortress of stone, nor a mighty earthwork, but a tiny, miserable island of high ground in the treacherous, insect-ridden swamps of Athelney, deep within Somerset. This was the king of the West Saxons, now reduced to squatting in a peasant's hut, his golden circlet traded for the damp chill of the reeds and the constant, throbbing fear of discovery. It was here, in this agonizing crucible of humiliation, that the famous apocryphal tale of the burnt cakes was born. A king so utterly removed from his station, so lost in the strategies of war and survival, that he failed even at the simple domestic task of watching the fire, earning the sharp rebuke of an angry peasant woman who had no idea she was scolding the last hope of England. This wasn't just a physical retreat, it was a spiritual death for Alfred. He had to shed the skin of the noble, victorious commander and become the ultimate survivor, blending into the mud and mist, learning the bitter lessons of true defeat necessary to forge the weapon he would need next. For weeks, then months, Alfred lived like a trapped animal, observing the movements of the Danish predators, studying their arrogance, and counting the few desperate survivors who managed to crawl their way into the relative safety of the marshes. These were the broken remnants of Wessex nobility and their fiercely loyal retainers, men who refused to bow the knee, their eyes burning with the cold light of vengeance. But even in the deepest despair, the legendary fire of the Anglo-Saxon spirit refused to be extinguished completely. From this desolate, watery hiding place, Alfred began to weave the fragile threads of resistance, utilizing the very landscape that protected him as a weapon against his flat-footed enemies. He was no longer leading a traditional army. He was commanding a network of whispers, shadows, and bloody, shocking strikes against the exposed Danish supply lines and isolated scouting parties. Guthrum's men, secure in their conquest, were suddenly being harassed by phantoms, their convoys disappearing, their scouts found lifeless in the morning fog. The attacks always swift, brutal, and impossible to trace back to a centralized force. Athelney became the silent headquarters of a terrifying insurgency, fueled by desperation and a righteous fury. Every successful ambush, every stolen Danish horse, every liberated sack of grain, was a small, defiant flicker of light against the suffocating darkness that Guthrum believed had already settled permanently over the land. Alfred, the strategist, was not merely surviving. He was meticulously rebuilding the intelligence network of Wessex, gathering information on the distribution of Danish forces, and meticulously planning the moment when the phantom resistance would rise up as a true army. The time for hiding was ending. As spring approached, the whispers, spread by messengers who risked instant execution, carried a single electrifying command. King Alfred was alive, and he was calling his people to the standard for the final, desperate gamble. The location was a place etched into the memory of every loyal Wessex man, the Stone of Egbert. Egbert's Stone, a secret rallying point near the borders of Somerset and Wiltshire, a place that symbolized the old glories and the former unity of their shattered kingdom. It was a pilgrimage of hope and terror. Imagine the scene. Men who had lost everything, their farms, their families, their trust, crawling out of the wreckage, arriving in small, nervous groups over the course of days, unsure if this was a glorious resurrection or a trap set by the Vikings. They were farmers, blacksmiths, former soldiers, and reeves, all armed with whatever weapon they could carry, their bodies thin, their resolve unbreakable. Then, through the morning mist, the figure of the king emerged, not in shimmering armor, but bearing the scars of the past months, speaking not of guaranteed victory, but of the absolute necessity of dying free rather than living under the iron boot of the heathen army. He had secured just enough time and secrecy to gather the scattered remnants of the Fyrd, the last professional fighting body left in the West. This hastily assembled force, the broken fragments of what was once a proud army, marched with a grim determination, every man knowing that failure here meant the total eradication of the Anglo-Saxon identity from Britain, replaced forever by the brutal efficiency of the Norsemen. Alfred used every strategic advantage he had learned during his exile, moving fast, staying off predictable roads, ensuring that Guthrum remained completely unaware of the gathering storm until the very last moment. He marched them through the night, a silent river of desperate souls flowing toward the place where destiny had drawn its line in the sand. The atmosphere must have been electric, thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and damp wool, as they closed the distance on the massive Viking encampment near Chippenham. This was the moment of truth, the point where the entire lineage of Cerdic, the long history of Wessex, the very continuation of the English language itself, would be decided not by negotiation or treaty, but by the clash of steel on the open field. They were marching toward Ethandun, a name that would soon be screamed in terror by the retreating Danes and roared in triumph by the relieved survivors. But first, they had to survive the unimaginable horror of the final, defining battle for the soul of England.